This is a robot from last year. We made it to the state championship. We were finalist Lions captain of the Nano division. And I'm Eli. This is Luke, Owen, and Liam. I designed a lot of the intake and transfer stuff on our robot, and I've done a lot of research and stuff on intakes and transfers before. So that's our presentation on. So before we get into all that, let's just quickly define what those are. So an intake is a mechanism that uses rotating parts to pull game elements into the robot so that you can later do things with them and score them. And the transfer is the mechanism that takes the elements from your intake to your scoring mechanism. It moves it through the robot. So cycle time is important to understand here, and what cycle time is the time it takes you to score game elements in teleop. So it's like the period between intaking, scoring, and then getting ready to intake again. That's your cycle time. And if you can score elements faster and get a lower cycle time, then you can have more cycles in a match. If you have more cycles in a match, you score more, you get more points. And so the time it takes you to intake elements and the time it takes you to transfer elements are a big chunk of cycle time, like half of it, or maybe more. So it's you can really save a lot of time. If you have a good intake and a good transfer, you can gain a lot of points that way. And when you're building both of these, the first thing to keep in mind is not speed, but reliability is more important. And both of these things sort of apply to robots as a whole, but if it's not working, it doesn't matter really how well it did perform. If it's broken in a match, you just can't play, you can't score. So that's more important than anything else, is having a durable, robust system that'll keep working all day and be able to intake and transfer stuff reliably. And then second to that in importance is the speed of it all. So your robot doesn't have to have an intake. The other way to pick up elements is a claw, but intakes are faster than claws. Claws are slow because they require more precision to operate from the drivers. You have to really line up on that element pretty precisely to get that claw in just the right spot, and then you have to press the button to grab it. And so you have to stop and slow down and drive. But with an intake, you don't have to do any of that. You can just drive right into the element, and then your robot sucks up the element just like that if you design your intake well enough. So the room for error is really high with an intake. If you're off by a few inches, your intake will still pick up that element if it's designed well. But claws are easier to make, so that is a benefit to them. But an intake will always be faster. So claws are good in autonomous and endgame stuff, because often the elements for autonomous and endgame, there's often specific elements that you only use in those periods of the game, like wall goals and ultimate goal. And this thing would be very difficult to intake, and if you really made an intake for it, it would be ginormous and take a huge amount of space in a robot, and you only interact with this thing twice in the game. So it's not worth all that work and effort and space and weight and motors to do that. So a claw is often better for those sorts of things, but for the main game elements in teleop, right, like the Fright Frenzy that you're scoring on the shipping hub, or the rings and ultimate goal that you're shooting, intakes are going to be better than claws. Hope I put it off. Working now? Okay. So in the perfect intake, as soon as you touch a game element with the intake, the robot has complete control of that game element, and it just goes instantly into the robot. So that's the ideal intake. That's the thing you want to build an intake to get close to. So how do intakes work? The mechanics of them. you have to like understand the mechanics of them so that you can build one that is well performing. So the main thing that makes intakes work is something called compliance, and that's the intake's ability to deform around game elements. This GIF here is really cool. You can see that wheel right there, that sky stone, it like pushes into the wheel and makes a dent in it, and that wheel's conforming around that stone there, as an example. So this compliance means that the rollers are always putting pressure on the element, and you need that pressure so you have friction, so you can pull the element in. So the rollers you need to be pushing and squeezing the elements all the time, so you can get a good handle on them and pull them into your robot. And this also is really helpful when you're intaking things in multiple orientations. I think I mentioned it when I was talking about claws. The best intakes can intake an element like pretty much no matter which way it's facing. So I mean, some elements there is no way it's facing; it doesn't matter. But other elements, right? This is facing different ways, and it might matter which way you're intaking it. But like the best intake for this element, for example, you'd be able to intake it if your robot's coming at it this way, or if it's coming at it this way, and the intake would sort it out. And the compliance allows it to do that, right? Because it allows the intake to conform to the different shape that's coming in. So there's two ways to achieve that compliance factor in the intake. The first way is to use rollers themselves that are squishy and deformed, like compliant wheels here, or a surgical tubing setup, like how we have on our robot here a little bit. I would say that's probably the most common way of doing it. And then another way to do it is have the whole roller itself move around the game element. And you can see it in this picture here, right? These rollers are mounted on these arms, and then when that freight comes in, those arms pivot outwards and expand to accommodate for the size of that game element, and those arms are like spring-loaded in, so they're putting pressure on the game element. Or you can do both at once. That image is both at once. There's compliant wheels there, and they're on those springy arms. So now Liam's going to talk about intake materials.
Alright, so for intakes, you want the rollers to be made of something like grippy, so it can grab the elements better. Non-grippy materials can be used, but if you design right, but grippy things work better because say we have like two elements here piled together. If the non-grippy material can't get behind it, then it can't pull it into the intake. But some popular materials are like compliant wheels, like these surgical tubing, rubber bands.
Also surgical tubing on this.
Rubber bands, regular wheels like this, and like 3D printed, like flexible 3D prints like this, as you can see, kind of bends.
That's what our robots intake used this season, was the 3D printed TPU filament.
And then there's more. Intakes will vary each year for the sizes and shapes of the elements, but they are surprisingly similar between seasons. It's really helpful to look at past and current robots for ideas. Many of the designs and ideas used in previous seasons can be applied to future ones. When you look at all the intakes, you can split them up into two major types, which is what Owen here will be talking about.
So, horizontal rollers are where the axis of the roller is horizontal and it kind of spins like this, and it picks up the game elements and it pulls on the top of the game elements. Yeah. Kind of like that, and then it squeezes the elements between the ground and the roller, or whatever ramp you have, and it can be fixed in place or dropped down to extend outside of the 18-inch limit for size for reach.
Yeah, so this robot right here is uses a horizontal roller design,
starts up here, and then it can drop down outside the robot, so it extends out of the sort of 18-inch cube size limit so you can get more reach. And this drop-down thing also means that it's on the end of this springy arm, and the entire roller can move up and down to accommodate the size of the game elements. Right, so like when a ball comes in here, it could lift up to accommodate the size of that. So it just spins like this, and then as soon as it touches the button, okay, let's try it. That's never happened before. It's also, we haven't maintained it super well in the off season. It's a little broken down. All right. So yeah, as soon as that those arms touched that cube, it was boom in that robot. And so, right, like I was talking about, we use these are something like this. It's 3D printed flexible plastic, and there's these little arms here. And when the game element comes in, this arm can bend, and then that bending of the arm puts pressure on it. And this flexible filament itself is not grippy, and we wanted to add that grip factor, so we added surgical tubing onto the ends of the flexible 3D printed parts, and surgical tubing is very grippy. So we get the compliance from these and the grip from the surgical tubing.
Alright, so horizontal rollers are vertical rollers are where the axis of the roller is vertical and it spins like this, and then if we have a cube or a stone, it'll basically pull it in to the intake, and it pulls on the sides of the element. Now, bottom rollers are basically an extension of an intake. They don't really need to be used unless you need to get like an element off the ground, for example, like a stone, and they can be added to any kind of intake, and they lift the element off the ground, like I said. And it's a good thing to add if elements get stuck on a ramp.
Yeah, so most commonly in intake, you'll have a ramp to like peel that element off the floor, like we did this year. Our robot just uses a plain old ramp. But sometimes it's hard to get that element off the floor, like especially in Ultimate Goal. There's very little, like there's not really an edge you can get under this ring with really well. And so what you can do is you can use a roller. This is way bigger than you would really use, but just demonstrating. And it's rotating this direction or something. So this face of the roller is moving upwards as it's rotating. And then as your intake is pushing or pulling this game element in, it hits this roller. And because the face of this roller is rotating upwards, it pushes that front part of the game element upwards and peels it up off the ground. And so then gets it off the ground into your robot. So yeah, they're good to try if a ramp isn't working out. If it's like catching on the ramp, getting stuck, you could try out a bottom roller design.
So those are the two major types of intakes: horizontal roller axis and the vertical axis. And which one should you use? Well, the best way to find out is to test each of them. I mean, that's the way to the best way to find out a lot of things in FTC. But you can eliminate options if you try to think about it or a little bit. So you want to consider the orientation that you want that game element to come in. Now, for some games, like the orientation of this cube or this ball, it doesn't really matter. You can score them in any orientation, they come in any orientation, you don't care. But some games, like Skystone, this block, you need to keep these studs facing up so you can place it on that tower. And it has to be this way, basically throughout its whole journey. So you want your intake to keep it that way. So, for example, in Skystone, the vertical axis rollers were really popular, where you have it on each side. And nobody used a horizontal roller. Because if you use a horizontal roller on this game element, if it's coming in this direction, it'll work fine. It'll pull it in, it'll work. But if you're coming in this way, right, one of the major benefits of intakes is that you should be able to intake from any orientation. Well, this way won't work so well because
this surface is a little more slippery than the actual field mats. The field mats have a little more grip, so when you're pushing on the top of this with that horizontal roller, it'll tip it over like this, and now you can't score this element because your intake screwed it up. So that's something to think about when choosing which kind of intake. And as for like choosing the right kind of material, that one is a lot of experimentation. But you can identify how much compliance you need. Like you can actually get a measurement. Like for example, for freight frenzy, this cube is 2 inches across, and this ball is 2.8, and you want an intake that can do both. And so the difference here, right, is 0.8 inches. So we need an intake that can like flex at least 0.8 inches to accommodate both of these elements. And Luke's going to talk about transfers.
So one of the big questions is, how do you take the game element that you're intaking and bring it from the intake to your deposit mechanism? Well, that solution is transfers. So one of the first transfers I'll be talking about is actually not using a transfer. Basically, the intake and scoring mechanisms are the same, and one of the things about this is you have to have the intake be able to move around, whether it's on a turret or whatever. Because if it's not able to move around, you're not going to be able to have a lot of mobility, and your cycle time is going to be way larger than if it had a lot of mobility and was on a turret, like 11260 Upper Creek Robotics, who won the World Championship last year. They were able to use, they had an intake but not a transfer, and they were able to do that very well. One of the things is it's tricky to move game elements to where you want to, as well as doing it fast, because you only have one little mechanism that's used for intaking, deposit, etc. And in addition to, intake running in reverse is not as good as a specifically designed scoring mechanism. And like I said, it usually isn't as accurate as if you say, you had a designated intake as well as a designated deposit mechanism. Although some games, precision doesn't matter as much, but in other games like Skystone, where you had to place the blocks on top of each other, obviously precision did matter a lot.
Yeah, so like you also might know Cyberhawks, their robot didn't have a transfer. They just got the element right in their intake and then just moved the entire intake above that shipping hub and run the intake in reverse and spit it out. And that's possible because that shipping hub it's a pretty big circle up there. You can be off by a few inches and you'll still get it up there, but some games require more precision in which that sort of thing wouldn't really work as well.
Another type of transfer is the direct transfer, where elements go straight from the intake into the scoring mech with nothing in between. This is very fast for cycle times because you don't have to worry about all this shenanigans in between. It just goes directly from the intake to the deposit mechanism. It's obviously much more simpler to build and program, but it's very good when you want to limit the number of elements intake. Like last year we had a possession limit, so it was very good if you didn't want to intake more than just one, because obviously you get a penalty for that.
Yeah, so in this design, your scoring mechanism has to be able to move to behind your intake so that the elements go into it, and then to wherever you want to score to.
So one of the most common types of transfers in FTC is the roller transfer, where you basically have many rollers in a line that move an element. In simple terms, you have an intake depositing into another intake, depositing into another intake, into your deposit. It can be done with belts, conveyor belts, surgical tubing, basically whatever you want to do, as long as it'll move the game element through in a timely manner, fast, whatever.
Yeah, so this robot is an example of that. Unfortunately, it's pretty difficult to see because everything was all built around it, but we use the same thing that we use on our intake. We just have another one behind that. So this one spits the element into this one spits the element into the one behind it, and so on and so on and so on, and it moves it along this path through the robot.
And finally, we have quite possibly, which is one of the hardest transfers to perfect. It's the moving intake transfer. The intake is like a no transfer system, but it deposits elements into the robot. So basically, you have your intake going outside of the robot, taking one of the elements, taking it back, and then depositing it into a specified deposit. You see the team 11115 gluten-free at the bottom right, and their Rover Ruckus robot, which was able to really use this to their advantage, and they ended up winning the World Championship during that year. As I said, it's one of the most complicated of all types because it is hard to program. It's obviously one of the least common.
So those were like 4 types of transfers if you include not using a transfer. So how do you choose which kind? Something to consider is the possession limit of a game. Almost every game has a possession limit, right? For Freight Frenzy, you can only hold 1 freight. It was the same for like Skystone, you can only have 1 block. Ultimate Goal, you could have 3. And if your robot holds more than that, you get penalized, and you don't want that to happen. And so, with a no transfer system, a direct transfer, and a moving intake transfer, you can make it impossible to intake more than the possession limit of elements, because your transfer basically fills up with the number of elements that it can hold. And this is really nice because you never have to worry about penalties, and you can be really aggressive when you're intaking. So for Freight Frenzy, all this freight was bunched in this big pile, and there's freight really close to each other like this. So if we just like run in there and we don't have anything stopping us from intaking multiple elements, you could accidentally pick up 3 at once if you're too fast or too aggressive. So you only really need to worry about this possession limit thing when the elements are really close together. In a game like Ultimate Goal, these rings were spread all over the field and they weren't really close together, so there was no worry of accidentally grabbing 2 at once. But in a game like Freight Frenzy, they're all bunched up, and so limiting the number of things your robot can possess is a good idea there, and can make you a little faster. And so those types of transfers can do that, but the one that can't is the roller transfer, because it's just this continuous line, this continuous stream from the intake to your scoring mechanism, so it'll just run everything through. And that's probably like the biggest weakness of our robot. This year we used this roller transfer, and then when we're in this freight pile, we kind of have to be really careful about not intaking more than 1. And so that's considering the possession limit thing. And then also just consider, where is your intake? Where is your scoring mechanism? How far is that distance? What does that path it takes look like? And which one of these designs would be able to cover that distance and be able to move the elements along that path? So that's the presentation. Does anyone have questions about all this?
I was wondering, for the drop down on your intake, did you use a servo or motor?
Yes, we have a. Yeah, you're kind of far back there. You won't be able to see. But there's a servo, and there's a little arm on that servo, and it's got a hook. And on our intake, we have a standoff, and that hook hooks around the standoff, and we move the servo, and then the hook falls away, and then that standoff gets free, and then we use rubber bands to pull this thing downwards, and also gravity helps. And so once that hook is released, it flips down.
What RPM motors or gear ratio do you run in your intake?
Yeah, for this, that's a good question. For this intake, this is actually on the slower side of intakes for Freight Frenzy. This is a 13.7 to 1 motor, just on a 1-to-1 ratio. I don't know off the top of my head what RPM that is. But yeah, 13.7 to 1 ratio. So yeah, getting the right RPM, you want that balance between being too slow and not having enough torque, right? If your RPM is too high, you won't have enough torque to move the elements, and then if it's too low, well, then your intake is just slow. So you have to find that balance. For most intakes, I think a good starting gear ratio would be like 5.2 to 1. We probably could have ran ours faster if we designed it differently.
For your robot, after you got the right, how would you like to
Yeah, so our transfer is a roller transfer, and there's the whole robot's like covering it up, unfortunately. But basically, we have this intake, right? And then behind the intake is essentially another intake, but this one's a transfer because it's after the intake, right? And so this just pushes the cube this way, and then once it pushes it up there, it hits
comes out the back here and falls into our scoring mechanism. So, let me just like that.
What wheels do you use for the roller transfers?
Yeah, roller transfers, you can basically use anything you would use for an intake, because that's essentially what they are if you break it down. They're just more intakes, but inside your robot, all feeding into each other. So on our robot, we use the exact same design for the roller as our intake. We use that exact same thing in the transfer. And you can use different ones, or, I mean, if that works for the intake, it'll work for the transfer too, right?
For the freight frenzy, for the transfer, did you have any problems in the freight frenzy? Did anything go not according to plan?
Yes. So our first competition, we showed up and our transfer was not finished yet. We literally finished building it once we got to the competition, which is terrible. And we ran into problems, obviously. So the biggest thing is that the transfer we went to our first competition with was not reliable. It broke down multiple times in matches because the screws came loose and stuff like that. And that's like the most important thing in a robot and in any mechanism. You want it to be reliable. So that was an issue. But then besides that, it couldn't intake balls the first time because these balls were too big to pass through. They didn't have enough space, so we had to give them more space by making that distance between like the floor of the transfer and the rollers. We increased that distance so that the balls could fit through.
So how do you deal with the timing of, like, if you intake something and the arm is out trying to deposit it? Like, how is there like a place where it like sits and then sort of that pushes it into the scoring element when it's ready? I mean, like, I know in Freight Frenzy you could only have one at a time, but like, let's say you can have like more than one at a time. Like, what would you do?
Yeah, so if your possession limit is more than one, you have to like store all those elements in your robot somehow. And Ultimate Goal is a great example of this. Their possession limit was 3, and so teams, they would go through their transfer and it would fall into this cylindrical thing, and then they would just like drop a ring in there, and then they intake another one, and the next one drops on top of it, and then from there, most commonly they use like a little servo to push it into their shooter. So yeah, if your possession limit is more than one, you have to like pull those elements in something, and you can actually use a like a no transfer system with a possession limit of more than one. Like in Rover Ruckus, you could like design an intake that could hold like 2 elements at once and stuff like that.
How did your team approach designing, all these systems that have to work together? Do you split up and you each tackle, a different aspect of it, or do you all work together on the whole thing, start to finish?
So, I mean, to be honest, our process wasn't super organized this year. We should definitely work on that. But for this robot, anyways, the intake and the transfer are really like closely integrated. So we kind of developed that whole system as one design, both the intake and transfer together. And then the scoring mechanism was like completely separate from that, right? You could make any changes on this, and it wouldn't affect this at all. So you could have completely different people working on this at completely different times. So, like, if 2 systems on your robot are really integrated, you kind of have to work on them both at once. But if they're not, if you can change them without affecting anything else, then you could split up into teams and tackle each part of the robot that way.
Yeah.